A black mother sprinted through the ER doors, her 10-year-old son limp in her arms. But the nurse barely looked up. "You'll have to wait," she said, turning to a white family who just walked in. The boy's lips were turning blue. The clock kept ticking, and then the mother noticed the name on the nurse's badge, the same name from a complaint she'd filed last year. But what happened next? No one was ready for it. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Elijah Reed walked the same sterile hallways every night, his gray cart creaking behind him, mop handle rattling with each bump along the polished linoleum. At 43, his back was worn, but his eyes were sharp. The MIT logo was etched into every tile, every door. For most, it was a symbol of brilliance, of futures being engineered into existence. For Elijah, it was just the building he cleaned after brilliance had gone to bed. No one asked him where he came from. No one wondered what he dreamed about. To them, he was part of the architecture, silent, necessary, forgettable. Elijah had worked the night shift for 11 years. Before that, he'd cleaned the labs at a biotech firm, until they let him go during a strategic reorganization. Before that, it had been a data entry job. Before that, community college. Before that, top of his high school class in Tulsa. None of it mattered anymore. Not here. Each night, he arrived at 10 p.m. sharp. The halls emptied by then, save for the occasional exhausted graduate student, or sleep-deprived postdoc whispering to themselves as they scribbled equations on tabletops or jotted notes on glass walls. They hardly noticed him. That suited Elijah fine. He liked silence. It made space for patterns. In Building 5, on the 3rd floor, there was one classroom he lingered near more than the others. Room 52120. Advanced Theoretical Mathematics. The course had a reputation, taught by Professor Alden Hart. It was known for breaking the minds of even the brightest students. Hart was eccentric, famously so, and had a cruel habit of leaving unsolvable problems on the board just to watch students squirm. He said it weeded out the pretenders. Elijah didn't like Hart's arrogance, but he loved the chalkboard. Some nights, after the students had gone and the halls went still, Elijah would quietly open the door to 520, wheel in his cart, and stand before the board. The symbols stared back at him like a challenge. Complex integrals nested inside fractals. Matrices of numbers twisting in recursive logic. It was art to him. A puzzle begging to be unlocked. He never touched the chalk. Not until that night. October had settled over Cambridge like a heavy coat. The wind howled outside the windows, rattling frames. Elijah was later than usual. A spill in the cafeteria had thrown off his rhythm. By the time he reached 520, it was just after 1 a.m. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the emergency lights. The board was full again. He stood in the doorway longer than usual. This time, the problem on the board was different. It wasn't just a test of logic. It had structure, rhythm, like a symphony of math, and something about it stirred a memory in him. A problem he'd once solved in a high school math bowl, except this one had 3 additional dimensions. Elijah stepped inside. He didn't know what compelled him. His hands moved before his doubt could catch up. He picked up a piece of chalk, felt its weight between his fingers. It had been decades since he'd touched one. He stared at the equation. Then slowly, deliberately, he began to write. Lines curved under his control. Variables danced from his memory. Old theorems awakened in his mind, like long-buried instruments being tuned back to life. He didn't think in steps. He thought in entire arcs, seeing where the math needed to go before the board even caught up. Minutes passed. Then more. He adjusted one matrix, reversed a function, introduced a constraint that eliminated 5 unnecessary variables. The room felt warmer now. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, unaware of how fast he was working. Outside the classroom, the hallway remained quiet. What Elijah didn't know was that Professor Alden Hart had forgotten his notes in the lecture room and had just stepped off the elevator. He walked quietly, his shoes echoing. When he reached the door to 520, he stopped. Through the glass window, he saw someone at the board, writing. He squinted. Janitor. The man who always wheeled his cart in silence. The one Hart had never spoken to, never even looked directly in the eye. And yet, there he was, solving it. Hart didn't move, didn't knock. He watched. Inside, Elijah stepped back from the chalkboard. The equation was complete, or at least he believed it was. He stared at it in silence. Not with pride, not with arrogance, just quiet recognition, like a sculptor who had uncovered the shape already hiding inside the stone. Then he set the chalk down. He didn't know he'd just solved a problem no one else had cracked in 6 years. He didn't know someone had been watching. He didn't know this moment would change his entire life. A chalkboard left filled with complex equations. Elijah stared, then picked up the chalk, unaware someone was watching. For 3 months, the equation on the board in room 520 had taunted the best minds in the building. It was a monster. A layered riddle designed to expose fragility and brilliance. Professor Alden Hart, with his gray suit and sharper tongue, had warned on the first day of the semester, "Anyone who solves this earns my private endorsement to Caltech or CERN. Everyone else, you're just here to watch." Dozens of graduate students had tried. None had gotten past the second line. It wasn't just complex. It was cruel. Recursive algorithms nested within incomplete logical proofs. A misdirection, with a second-order tensor tucked beneath an irrelevant constraint. Hart didn't want it solved. He wanted it studied, obsessed over, fear. But to Elijah Reed, a janitor with no formal math degree, no access to journals, no digital simulations, it looked different. He saw rhythms, not just numbers and logic, movement, flow, like watching dancers in wrong positions, waiting for someone to rearrange the choreography and make them beautiful again. He never set out to solve it. He only meant to look, the same way he had looked at broken gears as a boy when his grandfather taught him to fix watches. Back then, he didn't read manuals. He just studied the mechanism, waited for it to tell him what was missing. And that's what he had done last night. Now, as morning sun bled through the high windows of the hallway, outside room 520, Professor Hart stood still. He had arrived early, intent on finalizing lecture notes before his 10 o'clock class. But the board stopped him. It was filled, from left to right, top to bottom, not with frantic guesses or partially erased attempts like before, but with one elegant, complete answer, symmetrical, balanced, confident. Hart's mind tried to catch up. Who? He opened the door slowly, careful not to touch the chalkboard. His gaze moved from the solution to the floor, pristine. No scuff marks, no chalk dust on the podium, no notes left behind, just silence. He felt a twinge in his chest. It was correct. He could feel it. Not just the math, the tone of the work. Whoever had done this wasn't experimenting. They knew, and that terrified him more than he expected. Because it wasn't supposed to be solvable. Not really. Hart turned back to the door, stepped into the hallway. A graduate assistant approached with coffee, noticed his stillness. "You okay, Professor?" Hart didn't answer at first. Then, with a voice quieter than usual, "Who was in here last night?" The janitor probably. I left around 11, he was just mopping down the hall." Hart's eyes narrowed. Tall, black man. Quiet? "Yeah, Elijah, nice guy. He doesn't talk much, though." Hart didn't reply. He walked off, leaving his assistant confused. Elijah was 3 buildings away, wiping down the baseboards in the media lab. His cart parked neatly near the server room. He hadn't slept. After finishing the board, he'd quietly left room 520, checked the rest of his floors, and clocked out an hour before dawn. He told himself he wouldn't think about it again. It was a one-time thing, a moment of weakness, a whisper to his younger self, long buried under years of silence. But now, walking through the labs, he felt it like static behind his ears. The memory of the chalk, the way the math had flowed, how alive he'd felt, like touching a part of himself he thought had died years ago. He reached the end of the hall, pulled a cloth from his cart, and began wiping fingerprints from a glass panel. That's when he heard the footsteps. Slower than usual. Measured. Intentional. Professor Hart appeared around the corner. Elijah straightened, instinctively moving his cart to the side to make room. "Mr. Reed, right?" Hart said. Elijah hesitated. No professor had ever said his name out loud. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice quiet but even. Hart studied him. "How long have you worked here?" 11 years. "Ever audit any of the lectures?" Elijah shook his head. "Just clean the rooms." "You were in room 520. Elijah didn't respond. Hart stepped closer, his tone sharper. "You solved it." Elijah met his gaze. Calm. "I just cleaned around it." "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect you to believe anything, sir. That's your job." Hart stared at him, uncertain whether to be angry or impressed. There was no defiance in Elijah's voice, just a clarity that made the professor feel exposed. "Do you even know what you did?" Hart asked. "I recognized a pattern," Elijah said. "It was off balance. The variables were chasing their own tails. Once you invert the tertiary layer and remove the false logic constraint, it resolves itself." Hart blinked. That wasn't guesswork. That was mastery. He turned without another word and walked away. But his heart was pounding. Back in his office, Hart replayed the moment over and over. This janitor, this invisible man, had solved a problem that had stumped entire cohorts of graduate students, and he'd done it casually, almost carelessly, like it had been waiting for him. But Hart couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. If this got out, if the academic world learned that a black janitor had walked into his classroom and upstaged his students, it wouldn't be seen as inspiration. It would be scandal. Hart opened Elijah's personnel file. Name, age, employment status. No education listed beyond a GED. No academic history tied to MIT. No connections. And yet, he opened his email and quietly deleted the chalkboard problem from his course materials. Then he printed out the solution and filed it under his personal research notes. That night, Elijah returned to 5. The board was wiped clean. There was something colder in the room now, as if the space knew it had once held a secret too large to contain. He stood in front of the blank slate, unsure what he expected. Gratitude, validation, nothing. And in that nothing, Elijah felt the quiet return, the place he'd lived in for years, the space between who he was and who the world allowed him to be. But the next morning something unexpected happened. He was moved. His supervisor, tight-lipped, handed him a new assignment. "They want you on the biology wing now. Building 2. Elijah didn't ask why. He nodded, packed his cart, and left. But as he rolled his supplies down the corridor, a thought crept in. Someone had seen, someone had chosen not to speak, and someone somewhere had made a decision. Professor Alden Hart entered the lecture hall early and froze mid-step. Alden Hart had spent his life around genius. He could smell it. The arrogance, the quiet, the peculiar tics, the ones who moved through numbers like poets, through metaphors. But what he saw that night in room 512, he hadn't planned to return after their hallway encounter. He told himself he'd let it go, that this janitor had had a moment, a rare fluke of intuition, an accident of insight. But his curiosity gnawed at him. No one stumbled into that level of precision. So at 12:43 a.m., Alden Hart came back. He didn't knock, didn't alert anyone. He simply walked into the building, took the stairs, and walked. The door to room 5120 was slightly ajar. The lights were on. Inside, Elijah Reed stood at the board again. No cart this time. Just chalk in hand and eyes locked forward. He hadn't noticed Alden standing there in the shadowed hallway, watching him through the glass panel. He didn't know he was being observed. Elijah's arm moved fluidly. There was no pause, no scratch of uncertainty. His body swayed gently as if in rhythm with something internal. Numbers unfolded under his hand, like he was tracing something that already existed, not inventing it. Alden's breath caught. Elijah had modified the previous solution, not corrected it, but elevated it. He'd introduced a constraint neither Alden nor his own doctoral students had thought to apply. A lambda transformation that simplified the entire structure. What had taken Alden 6 years to construct had just been optimized by a janitor with no formal academic training. The moment felt surreal. The quiet in the hallway turned cathedral-like, sacred, but Alden still didn't go in. He stood rooted, arms folded, pulse rising, because for the first time in years, he wasn't the smartest man in the room, and it wasn't even his room anymore. Inside, Elijah took a deep breath. He didn't hear anyone, didn't sense the eyes behind him. All he knew was the way the math felt in his fingers again. His first love, before he'd been told to stick to trades or be realistic. Before the Tulsa counselor who never mailed his scholarship forms. Before the recruiter who never called back after hearing his voice. The symbols on the board felt like home. But something was different now. There was a tension in the room, as if the walls were holding their breath. He stepped back, stared at what he had written. The new configuration created a harmonic closure to the system, something that couldn't be taught. It had to be felt. He set the chalk down gently, then turned. The door was closed. He hadn't closed it. Professor Hart left the hallway before Elijah could see him. His heart pounded as he descended the stairs, taking them faster than he had in years. Not with panic, with urgency. Something had just cracked open inside him. A certainty he'd spent decades constructing had just crumbled. He reached his office, locked the door, and pulled up the campus HR portal. Search, Elijah Reed. The file loaded. Position, Night Custodial Specialist. Department, Facilities and Services. Tenure, 11. Education, G. Resume, not available. Previous employment, classified non-essential at previous termination. Background check, cleared. Alden frowned. GD was all it said under education. That couldn't be. He clicked deeper. Nothing. The system returned to the surface view. Clean. Quiet. Too quiet. A man with that kind of mind should have left digital fingerprints all over the place. Math clubs, patents, academic papers, online forums. Yet Elijah had no footprint. Hart narrowed his eyes. There were only two options. Either Elijah was a once-in-a-generation genius who had somehow slipped through every institutional crack for over 2 decades, or someone had helped make him invisible. He leaned back in his chair, then clicked the security tab. Request access custodial personnel entry logs for building 5. The system denied him. Restricted to supervisors. He wasn't surprised, but now he was certain. There was more here than anyone knew. The next day, Elijah returned to work, expecting normalcy. He was used to being overlooked. It was part of the job, and part of survival. He didn't need acknowledgement. But things had changed. He noticed it in the way students looked at him as he passed, eyes lingering just a second longer. A few whispered after he walked by. Something had shifted. He wheeled his cart past the math department's copy room when he overheard 2 students inside. Did you hear what Hart said in class? No. He erased the board this morning before we came in. Said we weren't ready to see it yet. What? I thought someone solved it. Yeah, but he said the solution wasn't meant for us. Elijah paused, then kept walking. That night, he skipped room 5. He knew it wouldn't be the same. Not after that. Whatever intimacy he had felt with the equations had been interrupted by awareness, by eyes, by whispers. It wasn't safe anymore. He finished his shift in silence. But when he reached the custodial closet at 4:06 a.m., something was waiting for him. A yellow envelope, unmarked, slid under the door. He opened it. Inside was a single printed document, a copy of the chalkboard from the night before, his solution, photographed, archived. On the back, a single handwritten note. Come to my office. Midnight. Alone. A.H. That night he came. He had no reason to trust Alden Hart. But curiosity had always been stronger than fear for Elijah. That's how he'd survived this long, chasing wonder in a world that only gave him locked doors. Hart's office was cold, wood-paneled, filled with books that looked expensive and untouched. The professor sat behind his desk, arms folded, watching Elijah with something between awe and restraint. You knew I was watching, Hart said. No, Elijah answered. But you kept going. I don't stop just because someone's looking. Hart leaned forward. You rewrote the equation, you solved it, and then refined it. I saw a better version. That's all. Hart studied him. That version was better than mine. The silence that followed was thick. Then Hart asked, almost whispering, why are you cleaning floors? Elijah looked around the room before answering. Because every room like this made sure I never sat on the other side of the desk. Hart didn't respond right away. He tapped his fingers on the armrest. There's no record of you. No school, no publications. Just nothing. That doesn't mean I wasn't learning, Elijah said quietly. Just means no one ever cared where I was learning from. Hart's gaze softened, just for a moment. What if I told you I want to bring you into the department? He asked. Elijah shook his head. As what? A janitor who helps out? No, Hart said. As a thinker. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't trust the invitation. Not yet. Hart could see that in his eyes. So he stood and handed Elijah a printed form. Ordered access. You'll be able to sit in on any class you want. No credit, no grades. Just observe. Elijah took the paper. For the first time in years, he felt like someone had handed him something with weight. Not a broom, not an order, an opening. But then Hart added, just be discreet. And with those 3 words, it all shifted again. Discreet. Not recognized. Not celebrated. Contained. And in that moment, Elijah understood. Even now, even after everything, Hart was still protecting something. And it wasn't him. That night, Alden pulled Elijah's personnel file. and found something deeply unsettling. Elijah Reed had a past no one ever asked about. In his quiet moments, he sometimes revisited it, like an old wound, before the janitor's overalls, before the empty rooms, before the muffled nights. There was ambition. There was a younger Elijah, eager, brilliant, insisting that the world see him beyond his skin. In his hometown of Tulsa, Oklahoma, he had graduated valedictorian of Booker T. Washington High. He had been the quiet star, top scores in calculus, physics, computer science. He'd competed in regional Olympiads. He'd coded startups in his spare time. Teachers whispered his name when scholarships were spoken at graduation. He had held dreams in his hands. He applied to MIT that autumn, his essays saturated with yearning and logic. He described his father's worn toolbox, his mother's faded notebooks, the nights he taught himself differential equations under a single lamp. He poured in every accidental discovery, every small triumph, every calculated risk. The rejection letter came in March. Polite, formal. Thank you for your interest. Unfortunately, we cannot admit you. They omitted any explanation. They didn't need one. Behind the scenes, someone had written, poor cultural fit, high academic risk, lack of exposure. That single line in the margin of his file had sealed his fate. Elijah never forgot it. He went to community college instead. He tutored others by night. He sent for textbooks. He audited online courses. He passed every exam he could. He built himself despite the door that slammed shut. He thought the past was buried. That line in their filing cabinet, under rejected applicants, could not touch him now. Not in the shadows of MIT corridors, mop in hand, not as someone whose mind they would soon realize they needed. But the past, it turned out, had teeth. Alden Hart sat in his dimly lit office, late in the evening. The light from the hallway cast long shadows across his bookshelves. He had printed Elijah's personnel file, moments earlier. The GED, the lack of records, the ghosted resume, but something nagged at him. If the man's intellect was this raw, where had it come from? He opened his email archive and began a deeper search. Admissions logs, archived student databases, reject letters, committees, hidden tags. He typed Reed, Elijah, across files, on every system he had access to. That's when he found it. In the 1999 Admissions Committee archive, in an old scanned folder marked Legacy Letters, was a central application file. He clicked in. The name Elijah T. Reed. Same birth date, same hometown. But the status, denied, poor cultural fit. He expanded the application. Academic transcripts, perfect. Standardized tests, top percentiles in math, physics, reading, essays, moving, brilliant, raw, letters of recommendation, glowing. One teacher had written, "He understands symmetry and pattern in a way I've never seen in a student." Another said he could one day lead in computational theory. Then Hart scrolled further down. A single comment had been appended, in digital ink. Flag DD. Hart froze. He'd recently seen that tag in archived admin logs on the envelope. Hart had opened in Section 2. D37, the hidden filter for underrepresented brilliance that institutions use to manage risk. As Hart had heard whispered from deans. But here it was explicit. Elijah's application had been flagged. Not because of grades, not because of essays, but because of a cultural risk label. In the margin, under that tag, another line, subject to alumni scrutiny, reevaluate in 5 years. Hart's heart pounded. The injustice leapt from century-old files to current reality. He closed the file quickly, but then something even more unexpected appeared. A linked scanned sheet from MIT's admissions office. It bore the signature of Marion K. Fletcher, admissions officer, class of 2004, the same name he recognized now from staff directories. Fletcher's name had not changed in 2 decades. She had signed the rejection letter in '99. She still worked in admissions, quietly behind the scenes. So there was someone within MIT who had seen Elijah's file. Someone who had decided to bury his brilliance from day one. Hart closed his eyes. Anger, shame, a harsh guilt, they all churned in his chest. He thought of his lectures, his public persona, his arrogance. He thought of the students he'd belittled. And now he realized the system he'd served had been crooked all along. Meanwhile, Elijah's days became heavier. The audit access paperwork Hart had given him lay in his locker, unsigned. He feared acceptance more than denial now. because any admission into the academic world would force him to disclose a past he never allowed to breathe in daylight. He walked the hallways observing students with notebooks open, theories spilled out in margins, expressions between fear and exhilaration. He felt deeply the divide, that world above, where ideas shone in conference rooms, and the world below where he belonged, the silent corridors of maintenance, carrying water jugs and mop buckets. One afternoon, while cleaning the hallway outside the admissions office, he lingered near the entrance. Two administrators passed by, talking in quiet tones. "Fletcher's file is up for review," one said. "The board wants to rewrite recruitment protocols." The second answered, "She's been overdue for retirement, but no one wants to push her out. She has influence. Donors listen." Elijah's heart skipped. He backed away silently, hearing what he was never supposed to. He realized Marion Fletcher was still powerful, still part of the machinery that had denied him. That night, he returned to the envelope message, "Come to my office. Midnight. Alone." He slept uneasy. At midnight, Hart's office again. The door closed behind Elijah. Hart's face was hard, haunted. "You know your past was erased," Hart said quietly. "I just found your old application." Elijah stared. His heart threatened to burst. "You were flagged D37, Hart continued. "That system, it exists. It's not rumor. It's been used for years to suppress merit from those who challenge the image institutions hold." He placed the printed files on the desk. Elijah sat. He didn't touch the papers. He stared down at the signature, Marion Fletcher. Hart stood. "She's still here. Still pulling strings. And she recognized your file, immediately. In my logs." Elijah's throat tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Hart hesitated. "I wanted proof." Elijah's eyes flicked to the ceiling. "I needed belief." Hart sighed. "What do you want me to do?" Elijah's silence felt heavy. "Then expose her. Let people know." Hart leaned close. "Will you be ready for what comes after?" Elijah swallowed. "I have to be." Then Hart turned and opened a narrow drawer in his desk. He pulled out a journal. Black leather, worn. He flipped it open. Inside were names. A list of flagged students. Many were unremarkable names, but some were extraordinary. Inventors, scientists, poets who disappeared into obscurity. No explanations, only code. D something. He looked up at Elijah. "You're not alone." Elijah blinked. What Hart just revealed wasn't just about him. It was about generations. On the last page, in Hart's handwriting, Project D Archive Confidentiality enforced. Elijah held his breath. He turned the pages upward. The first name, Elizabeth Carter, 02 D37. The second, Marcus Tolliver, 11 D30. Elijah nearly dropped the journal. His name, in Hart's secret ledger. All this time he'd been catalogued among the lost. Hart watched his face. That's how deep this goes. Elijah listed names in his mind. People he never knew. Innovations never birthed. The blow disoriented him. He looked at Hart. "I need everything you have." Hart nodded, closing the journal. "You'll have it." The weight between them felt ancient. Then Hart paused, voice low. "There's one more name in here, one that shouldn't be. A name you wouldn't expect." Elijah leaned forward. Hart exhaled. "Marion Fletcher's name is here too. Flagged early in her file. She was once evaluated herself." Elijah's breath caught. The very person who buried him had been buried in the system she helped manage. The admissions officer who rejected him still worked there, and recognized Elijah's name instantly. Professor Alden Hart had never invited a janitor to observe his lectures before. It wasn't out of malice. It simply never occurred to him that someone from the facility's roster might belong in a seat meant for intellectual elite. But everything Elijah had shown up ended those assumptions. So Hart extended the offer quietly. "Off the books. You can sit in," he said. "Back row. No registration. Just observe. Discretion matters." Elijah accepted, not for recognition, but for the opportunity to sit where he was once told he didn't belong. The classroom was full that morning. It was the graduate seminar on advanced computational topology, a room known for its intensity. Students sat in precise rows, tapping away on high-end laptops, coats draped on chairs bearing the logos of private prep schools and international Olympiad medals. The blackboard at the front glared with unsolved functions. Elijah stepped in a few minutes before the start, quietly taking the last seat in the back. He wore his custodial badge, despite Hart's suggestion to leave it behind. Something about hiding felt like losing. A few heads turned. Some of the students looked confused. Others looked annoyed. No one spoke. Professor Langston, a visiting lecturer from Caltech, entered briskly. He was known for his rigid tempo and unwillingness to entertain interruptions. Hart wasn't teaching this one. He only watched from the edge of the room. Langston began his lesson, diving into topological data analysis, with the speed of a freight train. His scribbles turned the board into a maze. But to Elijah, it wasn't chaos. It was layered structure, almost musical in its mistakes. Halfway through the lecture, Langston miscalculated a step. It was small, an assumption about boundary conditions that would compound into a false conclusion. None of the students noticed. Not even Hart. Elijah raised his hand. The air changed. Langston paused, confused. Yes? Elijah spoke, calm but certain. The assumption you made in the homology mapping. It collapses. If you consider the persistent module across the zeroth dimension, the error propagates through the rest of the proof. Langston stared, expression unreadable. The room was silent. A girl in the front row squinted at her notes. A boy beside her typed rapidly, then stopped. Hart, standing against the wall, watched without breathing. Langston approached the board, retraced the steps, and stopped. Slowly he turned. You're right, he said quietly. The silence thickened. Elijah said nothing more. Langston continued the lecture, but the energy had shifted. The students looked back toward Elijah more than once, not out of curiosity, but out of discomfort. A hierarchy had been interrupted. A floor had risen beneath them, and no one knew where it ended. After class, Hart approached Elijah in the hallway. You shouldn't have corrected him, Hart said under his breath. Elijah blinked, but he was wrong. I know, but there's a way things move here. Who you correct, how, when. It matters. You mean it matters that it was me? Hart didn't answer. He didn't need to. Elijah nodded slowly. You told me to observe, not to speak. I told you to be discreet. You asked me to sit in a room full of minds and pretend not to have one. The words cut deeper than Hart expected. He backed away, offering no apology. The next morning, Dean Margaret Calloway received a digital complaint flagged as anonymous, internal concern. The subject line read, Disruption to Academic Culture. The email detailed that a non-enrolled, non-academic individual has been attending closed graduate seminars and interfering with the pedagogical environment. It cited emotional discomfort among students, intellectual intimidation, and questionable access granted by a faculty member without administrative approval. Dean Calloway frowned. The tone was measured, professional, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Elijah's presence wasn't unwelcome because he was unqualified. It was unwelcome because he had outshone people who thought they were untouchable. She forwarded the message to Human Resources, then called Professor Hart. We have a problem, she said. Later that afternoon, Elijah was summoned by facilities for a routine meeting. He entered the cramped room expecting a shift change. Instead, two people sat waiting, his supervisor, and a man he didn't recognize. Suit, clipboard, neutral face. Elijah, the man began. We've received a report about behavior outside your assigned duties. Elijah sat. The man continued. It's been brought to our attention that you've been entering academic spaces during instructional hours. I was invited. By whom? Elijah didn't answer. He wouldn't risk Hart. Not yet. The man leaned forward. You need to understand, Mr. Reed. The university has systems for a reason. We're not here to question your character. But stepping outside your role can create tension. What role is that? Elijah asked. Custodial, night services. And what role allows someone to challenge wrong math? The man faltered. It's not about the math. It's about preserving structure. That phrase sat in the air like a confession. Preserving structure. Elijah nodded, slow and steady. I get it. They ended the meeting without punishment. No write-up. No reprimand. Just a cold reminder. Stay in your place. Back in his storage closet, Elijah sat on the floor beside the water heater, staring at the paper Hart had once handed him. Audit access. He tore it in half. It didn't mean what he thought it did. It was never meant for elevation. It was containment. The chance to watch, but not belong. To be tolerated, but not trusted. To be feared, not for misconduct or violence, but for daring to be exceptional. where he wasn't expected to exist. He remembered something his mother used to say when he was young. They'll let you shine until your light starts blinding them. It made more sense now than ever before. That evening, Hart found Elijah outside on a bench near the quad, sitting in silence under a fading sky. You didn't deserve that, Hart said quietly. Elijah didn't look at him, but you knew it was coming. Hart sat beside him. I didn't think it would happen this fast. You gave them permission to tolerate me, Elijah said. Not to respect me. Hart said nothing. The silence between them stretched. Finally, Elijah stood. You know what scares them? He asked. Not that I was wrong, but that I was right, and still didn't need them. He walked away. Hart didn't follow. Back inside the administration building, the anonymous complaint had been flagged for further review. But what Dean Calloway didn't expect was that another complaint had just come in, this time from a student. A girl from the class Elijah attended. She wrote, I didn't feel unsafe. I felt challenged. Maybe for the first time. Attached was a screenshot from her notes. Side-by-side comparisons of Langston's mistake and Elijah's correction. Dean Calloway stared at the email for a long time, then hit delete. The dean received an anonymous complaint. The next morning, Elijah was disrupting the academic culture. The accusation didn't come in a confrontation. It didn't come from someone bold enough to say what they felt out loud. It came as most institutional erasures do, via a quiet email. No emotion, no details, just cold, administrative precision. Subject, personnel matter, immediate attention required. Elijah Reed had just clocked in for his night shift. 10:02 p.m., same as every other evening. He was restocking paper towels in the third-floor sanitation closet of Building 2 when his phone buzzed. He wiped his hands on his overalls, unlocked the screen, and stared at the subject line. A second later, the time and location appeared. Report to room B1006 at 11:30 p.m. Compliance affair. No greeting, no contact person, just a room, a time, and an implication. Elijah didn't need clarification. A week had passed since he had corrected the error in Professor Langston's guest lecture. 1 minute he'd been an invisible custodian in the back of the room. The next, a room full of future engineers and scientists had turned to look at him, not with admiration, but discomfort. A janitor who dared to challenge a white professor. A man who wasn't supposed to know enough to be dangerous. Now the university was speaking in its native tongue. Indirect retaliation. He arrived at room B1006 at 11:29. The hallway was empty, silent. Most academic offices were dark at this hour. He stood outside the door for a full minute before knocking. The voice came through muffled. Come in. The room was smaller than expected. Sterile, fluorescent lighting. No decorations. A single rectangular table. 2 chairs, one already occupied. Behind the desk sat a middle-aged woman, with short gray hair, narrow glasses, and an expression that had been trained into permanent neutrality. Beside her, a younger man in a slim black suit tapped notes into a tablet. Neither wore a name tag. Neither introduced themselves. Elijah Reed, the woman asked. Yes. Please sit. He did. The woman glanced down at a thin manila folder, then at him. You've been the night custodian here for over a decade, correct? Yes. No prior disciplinary record. No. She nodded, as though confirming a memory. Mr. Reed, we received a formal complaint last week regarding your conduct in an academic seminar. She paused, waiting for him to speak. I was invited, Elijah said calmly. There is no official record of such an invitation. It was verbal. From whom? I don't think I need to disclose that. She blinked once. You corrected a professor during active instruction. He was wrong. This isn't about the content. It's about protocol. Disruption of classroom flow, unauthorized attendance, inappropriate interaction with faculty. Elijah felt the room closing around him. The man beside her cleared his throat. Several students in attendance also reported discomfort. They say your presence felt intrusive. Uncomfortable because of what I said? Elijah asked. Or because of who I am? The woman raised her eyebrows but didn't answer. Elijah leaned forward. Because I need to understand, if I'd been a visiting scholar who corrected that mistake, would this meeting be happening right now? The woman shifted in her seat. Mr. Reed, this is not a disciplinary hearing. It's a review of your placement and responsibilities in light of recent behavior. Which behavior? She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out a paper. We'd like you to sign a temporary reassignment acknowledgement. For the next 60 days, you'll be moved to Building 12 Storage Management. You'll also be asked to avoid any direct or indirect participation in academic spaces unless explicitly permitted in writing by a department chair. Elijah read the paper. No misconduct listed, no charges, no investigation, just perceived disruption and precautionary reassignment. In 2 paragraphs, they had erased the intelligence he had displayed, the solution he'd contributed, and the human being behind it all. I didn't violate any policy, he said. No, Mr. Reed. But perception can impact environment, and environment affects learning outcomes. The man beside her added, we're trying to maintain a harmonious balance. Elijah stared at them both. This isn't about harmony. It's about hierarchy. The woman offered a cold smile. Sign the form, Mr. Reed. He stared at the pen she slid toward him. For the first time in years, Elijah felt the weight of silence, not the peaceful kind he found in empty classrooms, but the manufactured silence people enforce when someone crosses a line they weren't meant to reach. He didn't sign. I want it on record, Elijah said slowly, that I am being reassigned not because of any policy violation, but because I made people uncomfortable by being right. The woman's eyes didn't flicker. Duly noted. He stood. Anything else, Mr. Reed? He turned to the door. Yes, he said. One day you'll be asked why so few people like me make it to the front of the room. And if you're honest, you'll remember this meeting. He left the room. No one stopped him. Later that night, Elijah returned to his supply closet and sat alone for over an hour. He didn't clean. He didn't sweep. He didn't move. His mop leaned against the wall, a symbol now of something heavier than labor. They hadn't needed to fire him. That would have drawn attention. They just cut his access, reassigned him to shadows, made his presence conditional again. They feared his mind more than his mop, because a mop served their comfort. But his mind, that disrupted it. And now, the institution was doing what it always did when someone challenged the status quo. It pretended to be calm, while silently applying pressure until the threat either yielded, left, or broke. The next morning, word spread across hushed corners of campus. No email, no public statement, just whispers. Elijah got pulled. I heard he's not allowed in the academic buildings anymore. Didn't he show someone up in class? No, I think he shouted at a professor. I heard he was stalking lectures without permission. I heard he forged something. The story mutated, because lies travel faster than discomfort. And truth, especially when it embarrasses the wrong people, tends to be buried under the weight of reputation. A few students tried to speak up quietly, in online forums or among peers. But without Elijah's own voice, without institutional backing, their concern dissolved into rumors. Some feared speaking up would put their fellowships at risk. And Elijah, he kept silent, because silence was safer than the consequences of being heard. 2 days later, Professor Hart came looking for him. He found Elijah in the Building 12 stockroom, unpacking boxes of floor wax. You didn't tell me, Hart said. Elijah didn't look up. Would it have changed anything? Hart exhaled. This wasn't the deal. I didn't know there was a deal. I vouched for you, and they reminded you who gets to write the rules. Hart stepped closer. I'm going to fix this. Elijah turned to him. You can't fix what you benefit from. Hart blinked. I sat in the back of that classroom and improved your lecture. Your whole department was supposed to be about merit, about mind. But the minute I stepped into the light, they didn't see a mind. They saw a mop with a mouth. Hart lowered his voice. This isn't personal. It's exactly personal, Elijah snapped. It's personal every time someone who looks like me gets told we're disrupting the culture, just by existing near your idea of excellence. Hart stood frozen. And Elijah added, more quietly, you know what scares them? That I don't need your system. That I learned without your curriculum. That I did what they couldn't without asking for permission. He turned back to the box. Hart walked away. That night, Elijah sat in the lecture hall again, not inside it, but outside the door. The board was empty. His seat was gone. He stared through the glass window for a long time. Inside, a group of students gathered for a late-night problem-solving session. They moved with the awkward confidence of people who believed they belonged. One girl noticed him in the hallway. Their eyes met for a second. She said nothing. She turned away, and Elijah for the first time felt something colder than rejection. Erasure. And yet in a corner office on the 3rd floor, someone was watching Elijah's file, not to suppress it, but to surface what had been buried. They didn't fire him. They didn't need to. They called it reassignment. wrapped it in terms like temporary adjustment and compliance review. But the message was clear. Step out of line again, and you're gone. 2 days after his closed-door meeting with Compliance Affairs, Elijah received a second notice, this time from facilities. A short memo printed and pinned to his locker. It read, effective immediately, all non-essential interactions in academic buildings must be logged and approved through your direct supervisor. Please sign and return the attached behavioral acknowledgement pledge within 20. A form was stapled beneath it. No other custodian had received one. Elijah asked around. Quietly, he approached Rick from HVAC, Tasha from grounds, even Lewis, who'd worked janitorial services for 23 years and took naps in the architecture lounge. None of them had heard of it. Nope, Rick said, frowning. Never signed anything like that. Sounds like they made it up for you, Tasha added. Louis squinted at the paper. Behavioral pledge? Hell is this? We ain't in preschool. Elijah smiled faintly but said nothing. He folded the form and placed it back in his pocket. They called it protocol, but everyone knew it wasn't about the rules. It wasn't just the form. That week, Elijah noticed things had shifted. The janitor's break room in Building 5, the one closest to the mathematics wing, had its code changed. No one told him. He only found out after trying the door one night and hearing the soft beep of denial. The next day, the supervisor told him the access code was updated for safety. Yet everyone else had it. Lunch breaks were another story. For years, Elijah had eaten alone in the quiet student lounge on the second floor of the computer science building. It was nearly always empty at night. He liked the natural light from the glass ceiling, the warm hum of vending machines, the whiteboards with equations left behind. Sometimes he'd work out problems for himself, quietly, just for joy. That week he walked in, tray in hand, only to find a printed sign taped to the door. Authorized personnel only. No custodial staff without escort. An escort to eat lunch. He stood there for a long minute staring at the sign, before turning around. The same week he passed 3 other janitors eating openly in staff lounges, laughing, sipping coffee, watching old YouTube clips on their phones. No signs were posted there. No behavioral pledges. No compliance memos. Just Elijah. Hart hadn't spoken to him since their tense exchange in the stockroom. Something had shifted in him too. He had begun attending more meetings with admin, missing his own office hours, leaving campus with a tight expression. There was guilt behind his eyes now. But also fear. Because even though Alden Hart had cracked the door open for Elijah, he was now watching the entire structure close in, and he didn't know whether to stand inside or out. Then something unexpected happened. At 1 a.m. on a Thursday night, while Elijah was disinfecting the library's central reading room, he was interrupted by a voice behind him.
You're Elijah, right?
He turned. It was a young woman, early 20s. Brown skin, big frizzy hair pulled back in a bun. She wore a battered MIT hoodie and held a folder in her hands. I've been looking for you, she said. Elijah set the rag down slowly. Why? She hesitated, eyes flicking to the hallway. I saw what they did to you, in Langston's class. And after, I'm in the same department. Elijah nodded. I remember you. She stepped closer. What you did, correcting him. I've never seen anyone stand that calm under that kind of pressure. They made it seem like you embarrassed him. But you didn't. You clarified. You made the math clearer. Elijah looked at her for a beat. What's your name? Zuri. You came here just to say that? She held out the folder. No. I came to give you this. Inside was a printed list. Names, IDs, application codes, dates. What is this? Elijah asked, flipping through the pages. People like you. Applicants flagged as non-traditional risk in old MIT files. I work part-time in admissions archiving. I wasn't supposed to see this. But your name showed up last week on an internal flag report, and it didn't make sense. So I dug. Elijah's fingers tightened on the folder. Zuri stepped back. You're not the only one they filtered out. How did you find me? I asked around. Most people lied, but one of the math PhD students mentioned you used to eat lunch near the comp sci building. I just followed the pattern. Elijah smiled, faintly. She spoke like someone who saw connections. You know they'll come after you for this, he said.
I made copies, she replied.
She turned to leave, then paused. I hope you don't stop doing what you do, even if it scares them. Elijah nodded, then watched her disappear into the night. That morning, Alden Hart arrived to his office, and found an envelope on his desk. No stamp, no return address. Inside were 3 items. A copy of the Behavioral Acknowledgement Pledge Elijah had been forced to sign. A copy of the admissions blacklist, with D37 circled beside Elijah's name, and a handwritten note. When brilliance scares the system, the problem isn't the mind, it's the mirror. Hart sat down hard in his chair, hands shaking.
The system he'd served, the institution he had sworn by, had begun to reveal its rot.
And now, someone else knew it too. That night, a stranger left a sealed envelope on Professor Hart's desk. The envelope was unmarked. No name, no signature, no institutional seal. Yet everything inside it was louder than any protest ever held on the campus of MIT. Professor Alden Hart turned over the 3 enclosed papers one by one, fingers slow, breath uneven. Each page told a story, but when read together they told a system. The first sheet, the one that chilled him most, was the exact Behavioral Acknowledgement Pledge Elijah had refused to sign, and then somehow signed. Hart's eyes ran over the language again. Any deviation from assigned roles, any unsanctioned intellectual engagement, any behavior that incites discomfort among credentialed members of the academic community. It read like a manifesto for silent labor, but it was the second page that shattered whatever walls of moral neutrality Hart still clung to. A spreadsheet, 28 names, scanned, not typed, aged formatting. Across the top, a header that looked like it had been part of a forgotten filing system from the early 2000s. Review of high-risk academic applicants. Cultural Deviation Index. It was a list of people, not criminals, not problem cases. Students, and not just students, applicants with perfect GPAs, national academic honors, Olympiad medals, and elite recommendation. Black. Every name. Row by row, the sheet documented each of their admissions review decisions. Columns labeled Sayed Composite GPA Recommendations Strength Interview Notes. Culture Risk Code Final Decision. Hart read down the Culture Risk Code column. It repeated the same 3 letters over and over. D37, D37. He'd seen that tag before, attached to Elijah's buried application from 1999. At the time, he assumed it was a relic. A one-off, perhaps. A cruel mistake. Now he knew better. It wasn't a mistake. It was policy. 20 years ago, MIT had instituted an internal review committee called the Legacy Fit Council. Unofficial, unadvertised, but real. Its goal was to preserve the intellectual and social ecosystem of the institution. That phrase, Hart now realized, had been code for protectionism. Code for redlining brilliance that didn't feel right, that didn't look like it belonged. The applicants on the list were brilliant, more than brilliant, disruptive, ahead of their time. One of them, Hart recognized instantly. Jordan Miles, class of 2003, valedictorian, published in Scientific American, as a high school senior, selected for early mentorship, under a Nobel laureate. She'd been denied. No reason ever published. No scandal. No controversy. She just disappeared. Another name, Camden Knox, a black male physics prodigy from Detroit, who had once built a quantum interference model from parts he salvaged from a junkyard. Denied. The comment, excellent mind, but likely to struggle with integration into institutional culture. Institutional culture. That phrase again. Hart kept scanning. Name after name. Profile after profile. All flagged D3. All buried. Until the last line. The final name listed was Reed. Elijah T. His heart dropped. Birth year matched. Application year matched. Decision denied. D37. Lack of institutional compatibility. He stared at that line for a long time. Then flipped to the last page, a printout of Elijah's full high school transcript. Perfect A's. Advanced calculus, linear algebra, discrete math, recommendations from every instructor, including one who had written, "I have never taught a student more gifted in abstract mathematical modeling than Elijah Reed. He should be teaching us." Hart set the papers down. Something inside him broke open, not just as a professor, but as a man who had spent his entire life believing in the meritocracy of the very system he served. He paced his office for 15 minutes, eyes blurry, the room spinning. He pulled open his laptop and searched for admission staff files. One by one, he checked employment records. And there it was.
Fletcher Marion K.
Still listed. Still active. Still buried inside the same office she had ruled 2 decades earlier. now promoted to Executive Director of Admissions Integrity. Integrity. The irony made Hart sick to his stomach. He checked the third-floor directory. Her office still bore the name. A new title. New secretary. But same legacy. Hart reached for his phone and stopped. What would he say? How would he even begin?
But before he could draft an email, he noticed something.
A second tab on the scanned spreadsheet. Hidden. Unlabeled. He clicked. The screen flickered. Then a line of text appeared. Legacy monitor protocol engaged. Faculty search triggered. Unauthorized access logged. His blood ran cold. Whoever had sent him this file had taken a risk. A massive one. And by opening it, Hart had just exposed himself too. He closed the document instantly. Too late. The access was recorded. Later that evening, Hart walked across campus toward the math wing, trying to find air in the thick moral fog that had wrapped around him. He reached room 5, empty. But chalk still clung to the edge of the blackboard tray, old equations, half erased, fading. He stepped inside. For the first time in his career, Alden Hart didn't know what to teach. He didn't know what to say. All the lectures he'd given about brilliance, objectivity, logic, they felt like propaganda now. And he'd been one of its most fluent speakers. The truth was, Elijah hadn't disrupted the institution. He had revealed it. Across campus, Elijah stood in the storage bay of Building 12, unloading boxes of bleach tablets and hand sanitizer. His mind was elsewhere. Zuri's face. The spreadsheet. The envelope. He had seen the list too. She had shared it with him the night she brought it. But now that it had reached Hart, it meant something else. Not just a record, a revelation. Elijah knew they wouldn't be quiet about it for long. Institutions were machines, and when you clogged the gears, they didn't fix the system. They purged the obstruction. In the admin tower, Marion Fletcher sat in her office, phone pressed to her ear. He saw the list, she said. The voice on the other end didn't ask how, just said, "We'll contain it." Fletcher tapped her fingers against the table. "No, we won't." Silent. She stood and walked to the window, staring out across the campus she'd helped shape for decades. "The difference this time," she said, "is that the janitor has proof." She hung up. Her face hardened. But something else flickered in her eyes. Not fear. Recognition. Because she remembered Elijah. She remembered denying him. And she remembered the note she'd scribbled in the margin of his file, 20 years ago, before hitting delete. Sharp. Too sharp. Will ask the wrong questions. Would not blend. Now those questions were coming back. One name at a time. Alden discovered a coded internal tag, D37. And then the list went dark. When Alden Hart first saw the tag D37, he assumed it was a classification error, a legacy code for tracking early applications, perhaps an internal department tag left over from outdated systems. But the deeper he searched, the more deliberate it looked. And now, with the sealed envelope and spreadsheet in hand, he knew D37 wasn't random. It was the quiet language of institutional bias, sophisticated in name, brutal in execution. Officially, D37 stood for Diversity Protocol Review Tier 3. On paper, it sounded like a mechanism designed to promote inclusion, a way for admissions to take non-traditional applicants into special consideration. But in practice, it did the opposite. It didn't uplift. It filtered. The documents were careful not to explain too much. No public-facing memos. No training manuals. Just an internal glossary, buried in archived metadata. D37. Applicants who present strong cognitive profiles, but display markers of cultural volatility, non-assimilative behavioral history, or external educational inconsistencies. Recommended for legacy committee flagging, do not proceed to general pool. Cultural volatility. Non-assimilative. These weren't objective terms. They were code for black, brilliant, and unwilling to dim for comfort. Hart couldn't breathe. He sat at his desk, hands shaking, rereading the file. Every applicant on the list had been deemed too intense, too independent, too unpolished for the MIT experience. And for over 20 years, the D37 tag had quietly filtered out hundreds of voices, minds that never made it past a room of decision-makers who mistook excellence for disruption. Hart leaned back, staring at the ceiling. They didn't blacklist laziness. They blacklisted potential that couldn't be owned. Across campus, Elijah stared at the same list. He had spent the last 2 nights with Suri in a dark corner of the student archives, a place he used to mop without notice, now pulling folders like classified secrets. She had stolen access. He had brought memory. And together they were building a case no one could ignore. Zuri traced the patterns. Every single D37 flag came with a note about culture, background, or fit. Never performance. Never ability. Elijah nodded. It was never about the math. It was about the mirrors. She looked at him.
What?
He repeated. They weren't afraid we'd fail. They were afraid we'd succeed, and make them question the reflection they'd built this place around. Zuri didn't speak after that. She just handed him another folder. He opened it. The name stopped his breath. Miles, Jordan A. Class of... He remembered her instantly. Not from MIT, from Tulsa. She was 2 years ahead of him, in high school. They weren't close, but he remembered her like some remember constellations. Visible. Unreachable. She'd won every math award he hadn't. Had once solved a citywide encryption challenge in under 2 hours. A mind sharper than any teacher knew how to handle. Elijah had heard she got into MIT. He'd also heard she left.
No one ever said why.
Now, in black and white, it was all here. She had been flagged D37, but somehow slipped through. Maybe an oversight. Maybe a temporary change in leadership. Maybe someone fought for her. But what stood out wasn't her admission. It was her exit. Expelled after 1 academic year. Reason: academic non-compliance. Mental health flag. Cultural tension with advisors. That wasn't a file. It was a cover-up. That night, Elijah sat alone in the same lecture hall where he'd first solved the board. The chalkboard was clean. Hart hadn't been in that day. Elijah thought of Jordan, of what it must have felt like to arrive, to think the gates had opened, only to realize they had admitted you to prove they could break you. He remembered her last day in Tulsa. Rumors. Her mother picking her up mid-semester. No one ever said the word expelled, because that would have implied guilt. What they really meant was, she didn't survive the architecture. Elijah took a piece of chalk, drew a single line across the board. Then he erased it. Meanwhile, Hart was sitting in the administrative archive wing, alone in the basement level. He had accessed an offline server through a faculty clearance code Zuri had given him. From there he traced the D37 protocol's origin to a memo from them. It was a directive from the Alumni Advisory Council on Institutional Preservation. That name had changed over the years, rebranded multiple times. But its purpose stayed the same: maintain the prestige of MIT through culturally aligned community development. Underneath that jargon, it was clear. Prestige, as they defined it, was not about IQ. It was about comfort for the established. Hart dug further and discovered what stunned him most. D37 tags had been generated automatically through an algorithm, a predictive cultural assimilation model designed by a research fellow in the late 90s. The model scraped application data, cross-referenced it with zip code, extracurricular history, essay tone, and in some cases, yes, surname frequency. It output a culture fit risk score. Any score above 85 triggered D, and it was still in use. Even now, Hart pushed away from the computer. Disgusted. MIT, the supposed temple of innovation, had been operating a silent cultural firewall, built on pseudoscience and sanitized prejudice. And the worst part? It worked. People never saw the ones who were missing, only the ones who were allowed in. The next morning, Elijah found an old email address for Jordan Miles, through a cryptic online directory. It bounced twice, then a reply. Subject: Ray. I think you knew me, Booker T. Body. I knew someone would find me eventually. I never got to tell my side. Tell me where. I'll come. JM. By the afternoon, Jordan Miles was on a train bound for Boston. She hadn't set foot near MIT in 18 years. Her hands trembled as she clutched a worn folder of old documents. A student ID, letters from faculty who ghosted her when she fell apart, and a final transcript she never showed her parents. She hadn't just left the institution. She'd left herself behind too. And now, for the first time, someone was pulling her back. Not for shame, but for truth. That night, in the empty lecture hall, Hart stood before his students. The topic for the day was recursion theory, but the chalkboard remained blank. Instead, he placed a single printout on the front desk. It read, D37, an invisible firewall in American academia. He didn't teach that day. He didn't need to, because the real lecture, the one that would change everything, hadn't started yet. It was still walking toward them. On a train, holding the proof in her hands. One name on the list had been admitted and expelled within a year. Elijah knew her. Before she broke, Jordan Miles was the golden girl. She had been featured in a statewide newspaper at 17, a black girl from Tulsa, with a brain for quantum theory and a mind for applied mathematics. Her high school teachers had called her a once-in-a-generation genius. She was the first student from her district to be offered early admission to MIT with a full ride. The press called her a prodigy. MIT called her a risk worth taking. But no one asked her what it cost. When she arrived on campus in the fall of 2002, Jordan felt like she'd made it to Olympus. She carried the hopes of her neighborhood, the pride of her community, and the weight of every "you're not like the others" she'd ever heard. Her first week, she was photographed for a campus diversity brochure. Her second, she was placed in the honors lab. But by the third month, the light had begun to dim. The microaggressions were constant. Professors mispronounced her name, not once, but repeatedly, even after correction. Group partners excluded her from late-night brainstorming sessions. One advisor joked that she should be proud to be admitted without a prep school legacy. A teaching assistant once pulled her aside and asked, "Are you sure this is the right fit for you? You seem overwhelmed." She wasn't overwhelmed. She was isolated. And isolation, when wrapped in intellectual coldness and cultural condescension, doesn't feel like solitude. It feels like erosion. By December, she had stopped going to the dining hall. By January, she started skipping classes. In February, she made the mistake of telling the campus therapist that she felt like she didn't exist. 2 days later, she was referred to the academic wellness board. 3 days after that, she was placed on involuntary academic leave. The official reason: elevated stress response inconsistent with program expectations. Unofficially, she had refused to shrink. Jordan never went back. Not to MIT. Not to the lab. Not even to her email. She packed her bags at midnight and left without telling anyone. Her roommates found her side of the room empty. The next morning, the sheets folded. She went home to Tulsa and didn't speak about what happened for years. To her family, she said she transferred. To herself, she said nothing. Because what do you call it when a dream ends without explanation? When your mind is fine but the institution insists you're unstable, just because you stopped smiling for their brochures? What do you call it when you break not from failure, but from the pressure of pretending you're not brilliant enough to make them uncomfortable? You call it academic stress. Because that's a label everyone accepts. And that's exactly what MIT did. They buried her story beneath that phrase: clean, neutral, plausible. They filed her breakdown away like a faulty circuit. And the machine kept running. Now, nearly 2 decades later, Jordan stepped off the train at South Station, with a small duffel bag and the folder she never meant to open again. Elijah was waiting by the benches near the taxi stand, hands folded, face still. She saw him before he saw her. When their eyes met, neither smiled. Too much had been lost between then and now. "Hey," Elijah said quietly. Jordan nodded. "You look exactly the same." He shook his head. "You don't. I get that a lot." They didn't hug, just walked side by side toward the parking garage, past Wall's advertising conferences and innovation labs, as if none of it had ever turned on them. They reached Elijah's car and sat inside for a moment, the silence humming louder than the engine. "You saw the list," Jordan finally said. "I did. And you saw what they wrote about me." "I did." She looked away. "It was all true, you know. The breakdown. The stress. I just didn't know they were planning it." Elijah turned toward her. "Planning it?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a photocopy, old, faded, stapled in the corner. He unfolded it. At the top, internal observation memo, Jordan Miles, Term 1. It was dated 3 weeks after she arrived. The memo outlined concerns over cultural integration, non-responsiveness to advisor mentorship, and limited social engagement with peer cohort. It recommended soft monitoring, proactive mental health check-ins, and documented behavioral responses to academic pressure. Elijah looked up, stunned.
"They built a file," he said.
Jordan nodded. "Before anything happened," he whispered. "Before you even struggled." "They weren't waiting to help me," Jordan said. "They were waiting for me to collapse." Elijah swallowed hard. Her voice lowered. "And when I finally did, they already had the paperwork ready." He held the memo in shaking hands. It wasn't just what they'd done. It was how calmly they'd done it. Later that evening, they sat in Elijah's apartment. He poured tea while Jordan unfolded more of her old documents. She laid out rejection emails, advisor meeting notes, and therapist referrals. She had kept everything. "Why?" he asked. Jordan stared at the papers. Because I knew someday I'd have to prove I wasn't crazy. Elijah leaned forward, hands on his knees. You weren't. They made me feel like I was. He looked her in the eye. What if you told your story now? Jordan exhaled slowly. Would it matter? To me? It already does. She stared at him for a moment. What do you want to do, Elijah? He looked down at the file. Then, slowly, said, I want to take all of this and make sure no one like us ever gets erased again. Jordan leaned back in her chair. She didn't smile, but she didn't say no. Later that night, Elijah called Professor Hart. Hart answered on the second ring. You need to hear what she just told me, Elijah said. His voice was low but trembling. What is it? Elijah paused. She has documentation. Proof that they were tracking her from day one, waiting for her to break. They called it support, but it was surveillance. Hart was silent. Then, how much does she have? A full file, memos, internal logs. Everything. She saved it all. Hart sat up straighter. Elijah continued. It's not just her story. It's evidence that D37 wasn't just a filter. It was a setup. And you're sure it can be traced? I'm sure. On the other end, Hart whispered. Then this is bigger than just admissions. It always was. Elijah contacted her. What she told him made his hands shake. The documents Jordan kept were more than evidence. They were a map, and buried inside them was a name Elijah hadn't seen before. At first it looked like just another reference to a now-defunct committee, tucked in the corner of a scanned memo dated 2002. But the wording stuck with him. Submitted for secondary flag review by the Heritage Circle. Heritage Circle? He circled the phrase and read. 2 nights later, he and Jordan met with Zuri in the archives again. The office was empty, not abandoned, just neglected. Dust lined the drawer handles. The air was thick with forgotten paper and quiet truths. They worked in silence, combing through old alumni directories and internal faculty minutes, looking for any mention of the group. Zuri was the first to find something. She flipped through a beige binder marked Development and Donor Relations. Found it, she said. A single-page memo. Handwritten, scanned, then buried under innocuous labeling. It read, Effective fall admissions cycle. The Heritage Circle is to be granted advance review of high-profile applications, flagged for cultural risk or alumni relevance. Faculty liaisons should consult with development chairs when in doubt. The header? Confidential internal use. Legacy Influence Network. Jordan's face turned pale. Elijah looked up slowly. This wasn't just admissions bias, he said. This was coordinated. The more they dug, the clearer it became. The Heritage Circle wasn't listed anywhere public. It had no official meetings, no campus events, but it appeared over and over again in archived minutes, donation letters and redacted emails. A quiet network of influence. Its membership, while never fully listed, included faculty, high-level donors, select trustees and legacy alumni. They weren't just evaluating applications. They were curating the identity of the institution. One internal note even included a quote. MIT must continue to reflect, not just excellence, but excellence that reassures. Reassures whom? The answer was in the pattern. The admissions that were fast-tracked, the recommendations mysteriously uplifted, and most damning, the rejections that followed every time a D37 tag was triggered. This wasn't just racism. This was a maintenance protocol, an invisible gatekeeping system. They called it legacy culture preservation, but it was designed to keep the equation of black brilliant from ever becoming too common inside MIT's walls. Jordan stared at one memo for a long time, then handed it to Elijah. I remember this. The memo was a faculty exchange between 2 professors in her former department. Miles continues to exhibit strain. I fear we're forcing assimilation without integration. Heritage has concerns about long-term image impact. That word again. Heritage. They were watching me like I was a liability, she whispered. Not a student. Zuri looked between them. How is this not illegal? Elijah's voice was flat. Because it wasn't written into law. Just culture. 3 hours later, Elijah returned to his apartment. He sat at his desk surrounded by copies, notes, photos, all pointing to one undeniable conclusion. The rejection of people like Jordan, like himself, hadn't been accidental. It had been designed. He picked up a thin manila folder Zuri had slipped into his bag earlier. Old faculty liaison listings, internal only, she had said. He hadn't opened it until now. Inside were dozens of names. Committee chairs, ethics board members, financial liaisons. consultant. And at the bottom, a line that made his chest tighten. Hart, Alden T., faculty liaison, Heritage Circle. 19. His throat dried. He read the line again. Hart's name. 3 decades earlier. Elijah sat still for a long moment. The sound of the city far below like static in his ears. He hadn't expected this. Not from the man who had watched him solve equations. Not from the professor who had handed him audit papers. Not from the only one who had seemed to see his mind. Not his mom. But there it was. Clear. Unambiguous. Alden Hart had once stood at the very gate that now tried to keep Elijah out. He'd been part of the machine. Maybe even one of its architects. Elijah didn't sleep. The next morning, he walked across campus with the folder clutched under his coat. The same buildings looked different now. Colder, sharper. Each step echoed with betrayal. He reached Hart's office at 7:56. Knocked once. The door opened quickly. "Elijah," Hart said, surprised. "You're early. I need to ask you something." Hart stepped aside. "Of course." Elijah placed the folder on the desk, opened it, flipped to the final page, and pointed. Hart's eyes scanned the line. Then again. Then again. His shoulders tensed. "I can explain," he started. "No." Elijah cut in. "Not yet." Hart looked up. Elijah's voice was calm, but beneath it fire raged. "You were part of it." Hart nodded slowly. "Years ago, before I understood what it really was. I thought it was about guiding legacy candidates. I didn't know the algorithm, the D37 flag. I didn't understand what they were doing with it." "You never asked." "I was young. I was told we were protecting the culture." "And, you believed that?" Hart didn't answer. Elijah leaned forward. "I need to know," he said, voice razor thin. "Did you see my name back then? Did you help bury it?" Hart's face went still. "I don't remember," he said. "That's not good enough. I didn't have final say. But you had a say." Hart lowered his gaze. "I saw hundreds of files," he said quietly. "Yours may have been among them. I can't say for sure." Elijah stood up. "That's the problem. People like me, we remember everything. Every door that didn't open. Every room we weren't allowed in. But people like you just move on." Hart swallowed hard. "I didn't come here for revenge," Elijah said, heading for the door. "I came here for truth, and now I have it." He paused, hand on the doorknob. "You don't get to be neutral anymore." He left without another word. Elijah discovered Alden's name was once tied to it. 30 years ago, long before Elijah Reed ever pushed a mop down MIT's polished halls, Alden Hart had sat on the other side of the system, not as a gatekeeper, but as an ambitious young professor desperate to prove he belonged. It was the fall of 1996 when she walked into his seminar. Her name was Talia Brooks, a second-year black student from Philadelphia, soft-spoken but searingly intelligent. She didn't ask for attention. She earned it. Alden had been new then, barely out of his own graduate program, teaching as an assistant under a notoriously old-school department chair. His lectures were exact, his boundaries clear. But Talia disrupted all that. She didn't just understand his material. She challenged it. Politely, sharply, publicly. One afternoon she proposed an alternative proof during a class discussion on recursive function theory. Alden brushed her off, citing an older model. But after class she stayed behind, and showed him why she was right. He never credited her. And when she raised her voice again in a later session, this time correcting another professor during a department colloquium, things started to shift. She was marked difficult, too forward, uncoachable. No one said too black, but the echo rang anyway. Within months Talia began to unravel. Late assignments, missed deadlines, unreturned calls. Alden watched from a distance, as the institution closed in around her like ivy, slowly tightening. He did nothing. One day she just stopped showing up. Later he heard she'd transferred, and even later, that she had dropped out entirely. He never saw her again. He told himself for years it wasn't his fault, that he wasn't in a position to help, that he hadn't meant harm. He just hadn't known what to do. But when Elijah stood in his office, holding that folder, holding truth, Alden felt the same sick silence creep up his spine. And this time he couldn't pretend it wasn't his problem. That night, Alden sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by papers, memories, and too many rationalizations. He thought of Elijah's eyes, calm but burning, and of Jordan's file, so similar to Talia's. He thought of how many names had passed through his hands, how many doors he had quietly watched close. and he thought of the Heritage Circle. He had never attended a single meeting after 1998. Not after he began to see what they were really doing. But he had stayed silent. Let his name remain on the liaison list. Let his influence be used to shape decisions he never reviewed. That was the thing about systems like MIT's. You didn't have to be evil. You just had to be compliant. And now, Alden Hart had reached the edge of his own silence. He opened his laptop, typed out an email with one line. I need to speak. Publicly. No more hiding. He sent it to every faculty listserv, student paper, and media liaison connected to the institute. The next morning, chaos broke. Campus Communications sent out a memo at 7. Professor Alden T. Hart has requested a public forum to address concerns related to admissions practices and legacy structures. This forum is not sanctioned by the university. Attendance is not required and does not reflect the position of MIT. By 9 a.m., the student paper had leaked it. By 10:30, over 300 students had RSVP'd. And by noon, a formal message came from the office of the president. Due to the sensitive nature of internal matters currently under review, we ask that faculty refrain from making unapproved public statements that may damage the reputation or legal standing of the institute. Hart read it twice, then deleted it. At 3:00 p.m., he held the door open to lecture hall B37 and watched the crowd pour in. Students, staff, janitors, journalists, even 3 members of the Alumni Review Board, who arrived silently and sat near the back. Elijah stood in the shadows, just inside the doorway. He said nothing, but Hart saw him. The room filled fast. The atmosphere wasn't tense. It was charged, as if every chair had been waiting for this reckoning. Hart walked to the front. No slideshow, no handouts. Just him, a mic, and a packet of printed documents resting beside a folder stamped, confidential. I won't be long, he began, voice steady. But I will be clear, he paused. In 1995, I joined the faculty here as a young academic, eager, grateful, and blind. He picked up the packet. This is a list of students flagged by a system we were told was designed to ensure institutional culture, the D37 protocol. A code, nothing more, but one that filtered out brilliant minds based on fear, bias, and the comfort of tradition. He turned a page. This is the Heritage Circle, a group of faculty and donors who operated unofficially for decades to curate who belonged at MIT. I served as a liaison once. I didn't ask enough questions, and now I know what that cost. He took a breath. One of those names was Elijah Ree. A ripple moved through the audience. He applied in 1999, valedictorian, math prodigy, denied, labeled a cultural risk. Hart looked up, eyes scanning the room. He now works here as a janitor, a man who solved a problem my entire department couldn't, quietly, anonymously, until I saw him. Another pause. And even after I did, I asked him to be discreet. Because I was afraid of this moment, afraid of the institution turning its power against me the way it's turned it against so many others. He stepped from the podium, his voice lower now. No, I'm not afraid anymore. Campus security entered the room 10 minutes later. A dean followed, her face tense. She whispered something to Hart, who handed her the mic and walked away. But the room erupted. Students began chanting, D37. Others held up signs they had scrawled during the talk. Rejected male unworthy. Who else was flagged? Cleaners. Thinkers. Builders. And in the corner unnoticed by most, Elijah turned to leave. But someone followed him out. Jordan. She handed him her folder. This belongs to all of them now, she said. He nodded. And as they stepped into the cold evening air, the first tweet went viral. MIT prof goes rogue. Reveals secret blacklist filtering out black excellence. Names dropped. System exposed. And D37 gate. Academic racism. He called a press conference. The university tried to stop him. They didn't expect him to go through with it. After Hart's unsanctioned speech in lecture hall B37, the university hoped the news cycle would move on, that the story would collapse under the weight of deniability. A single professor speaking out was noise. Inconvenient, but manageable. What they didn't count on was the live stream. At 7:59 p.m., less than 48 hours after Hart's impromptu forum, a link appeared on the MIT Student Hub, then on Twitter, Reddit, and academic subforums around the country. Leave in 60 seconds. Professor Alden Hart, the D37 list. The title was bold, raw, irrefutable. By 8:03 p.m., over 70,000 viewers were watching. By 8:10, the number crossed 300,000. By 8:15, CNN had picked it up. And at 8:19 p.m., a second figure stepped into frame. Elijah Reed. He wasn't in janitor's overalls. He wore a plain dark shirt. His posture was calm, grounded. He said nothing. Just stood behind Hart, centered, unmoving, present. Hart opened the live stream with one sentence. MIT must answer for this. He placed a manila folder on the podium. This is not a conspiracy. It is not speculation. It is not bitterness. It is a documented, decades-long pattern of exclusion disguised as administrative protocol. He raised the folder. It's called a tag used internally to flag applicants from underrepresented backgrounds who were deemed cultural risks. It has denied thousands of qualified individuals admission to this institution, individuals whose only failure was not fitting the image that certain people wanted to preserve. He paused, letting it sink in. Then he began to read, name after name. Jordan Miles, accepted then surveilled, then expelled under the guise of stress. Camden Knox, genius-level IQ, rejected after a Heritage Circle review. Elijah Reed, valedictorian, Olympiad winner, denied with the note, too independent, too much potential to destabilize cohort dynamics. The comments hit like punches. Each name he read was followed by a line from their application, achievements so breathtaking they made the rejections feel crueler. Elijah never moved. He didn't flinch when his name was read. He had lived that line for over 2 decades. Now the world was reading it too. In the chat window on the live stream, thousands of messages flooded in. This is horrifying. How many did we lose to this? He was a janitor? MIT, do you have anything to say? This changes everything. Donors started calling. Former students posted their own stories. Professors at other elite schools tweeted support. Journalists scrambled to verify the documents, only to find the internal tags matched leaked admissions spreadsheets. No one was denying it now. The silence had broken, and in its place came rage. By the time Hart finished reading the final name, 712,000 people were watching. He closed the folder and looked into the camera. This institution has produced some of the most powerful thinkers on Earth, but it has also quietly, deliberately discarded brilliance it didn't know how to control. He stepped aside. Elijah walked forward. He didn't speak from notes. He spoke from memory. I was 17 when I applied here, he began. I thought this place was built for people like me, people who love numbers, people who think in shapes and patterns and questions that don't have names yet. He looked straight into the lens. They told me I didn't fit. They never said why. But now I know. It was never the math that made them nervous. It was the fact that I didn't need their permission to be good at it. The chat exploded again. He continued. I've mopped your floors. I've watched lectures from behind brooms. I've seen students trip over concepts I could solve in my sleep. And I stayed quiet. Not because I lacked voice, but because this place taught me that brilliance without permission is treated like trespass. He paused. No more. Hart stepped back beside him. The stream faded to black. Back on campus, the Board of Trustees met in emergency session. No press. No notice. Just 12 people, seated around a glossy oak table, deciding how to protect the name they had spent decades polishing. The president's assistant entered with a printed summary of the stream, handed it silently to the chair. The chair read it. Quietly. Carefully. Then said only 2 words. Disciplinary action. At 10:23 p.m., Elijah and Hart each received an email. Subject. Notice of administrative review.
It was clinical, precise.
Due to recent unsanctioned activities conducted via unofficial channels, and pending a full investigation into potential breach of institutional confidentiality, your positions at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology are subject to immediate review and potential suspension, effective immediately. No thank you. No acknowledgement of the information shared. No concern for accuracy. Just power. Swinging the way it always did. Downward. In Elijah's apartment, Jordan and Zuri stared at the message over his shoulder. They're coming after you, Zuri whispered. No, Jordan corrected. They're coming after all of us. Elijah didn't flinch. He stood up, walked to the table, and opened the folder again. They've controlled the narrative for 20 years, he said. We only needed 1 hour to break it. Zuri looked at the screen. It's already trending globally, she said. D37 Gate is everywhere. You're being called the hidden mind of MIT. Elijah shook his head. This was never about me. He pointed at the list. It's about all the names no one bothered to say out loud. Jordan exhaled. And that's when Elijah's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He picked it up anyway. A woman's voice. Older. Steady. Elegant. Elijah Reed? Yes. I'm the largest private donor MIT has ever had. And I just watched your live stream. Elijah said nothing. She continued. I want to meet. Tonight. Alone. He paused. Why? Her voice dropped. Because I know what D37 really was. The board announced emergency disciplinary action against Alden and Elijah. The suspension letters landed like quiet bombs. No press releases, no explanations. Just internal memos circulated through faculty inboxes, time-stamped and sterile. Effective immediately, Professor Alden Hart and staff member Elijah T. Reed are relieved of all institutional duties pending further administrative investigation. Elijah's badge was deactivated before sunrise. Hart's faculty portal login returned an access denied screen within hours. It was supposed to be a silencing, a warning, a quiet reminder that no matter how noble your intention, no one speaks for the institution unless the institution approves. But MIT had underestimated the internet. By noon the next day, the video of the live stream had been reposted across every major platform. It wasn't just viral, it was incendiary. D37 Gate trended globally within 24 hours. News anchors quoted Hart's speech like scripture. Former applicants from across the world began sharing eerily similar rejection stories, most from underrepresented backgrounds. Screenshots of cryptic notes, suspicious interview feedback, and patterns of racial filtering emerged in every thread. Some even posted rejection letters dated years apart with matching handwritten symbols in the margins, a circle around the letter D, followed by a slash and two numbers. D37. It was no longer theory. It was systemic. And it was spreading. Elijah watched it unfold from his apartment, the same space he used to come home to after mopping lecture halls, now filled with reporters' emails and offers to share his story. He declined them all. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in truth. Jordan was with him, answering calls, organizing the documents they'd collected into a cloud drive. Zuri was coordinating with legal aid groups, who offered support pro bono. You're not going back there, Zuri said, glancing at his deactivated badge on the counter. I was never in there, Elijah replied. Not really. Jordan walked over, her face pale. BuzzFeed just did a full spread. They're calling it the most racially sophisticated rejection system in modern higher education history. Elijah didn't blink. Good. But beneath his stillness was a fire, not rage, but clarity. It had taken decades of silence to build the system. Now it was being unraveled in days. And yet, for every 1,000 voices rising to amplify the story, Elijah kept thinking about the one voice that had reached out in private. The woman from the phone call. The one who claimed to be MIT's top donor. The one who said she knew what D37 really was. Her name was Lucille Adair. She donated over $90 million to MIT in the last 20 years. Her name carved into the side of the biomedical engineering wing, etched into plaques, whispered during capital campaigns. She rarely gave interviews. She never made public statements. Until now. Elijah met her at a discreet cafe in Cambridge. The next night, just blocks from the dome that had denied him at 17. She was already seated when he arrived, composed, elegant, and not at all surprised to see him. Mr. Reed, she said, extending a hand. Thank you for coming.
He sat down without speaking.
Lucille studied him. You've changed everything, she said softly. And I want you to understand something. I've been funding this institution since before your rejection letter was ever typed. But until last night, I didn't realize what I was really investing in. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Didn't realize. Or didn't look. Lucille didn't flinch. I suspected. For years. But the problem with privilege, she said, is it lets you walk away from suspicion without consequences. She placed a small black folder on the table. Elijah, I once sat on the confidential donor advisory board, the one that intersects with development, legacy, and heritage. Elijah's body stiffened. Lucille leaned forward. I didn't know about the D37 label then, but I knew there were conversations about preserving image, about curating cultural fit. I should have asked harder questions. I didn't. He waited. She pushed the folder toward him. I resigned from that board this morning. Elijah opened the folder. Inside was a signed statement. It was addressed to the Board of Trustees, the Office of the President, and every major national media outlet. In it, Lucille confessed her involvement in institutional structures that supported silent filtering of applicants. She named names. She confirmed the existence of the Heritage Circle. And at the end she announced, "Effective immediately, I am freezing all current and future donations to MIT until a full public audit of the D37 program and associated legacy review mechanisms is conducted with external oversight and reparative action." Elijah read it twice, then looked up. Lucille's voice lowered. "I've spent 20 years funding innovation. But what you did, what you exposed, that's revolution." He didn't respond. She continued, "I want to fund something else now." Elijah leaned back. Lucille smiled gently. "I want you to build your own institute, your own place, not inside someone else's shadow, not waiting for someone's permission." Elijah stared at her. "I want to give you $10 million, she said, calm as ever, "to create a school for minds like yours, and all the ones they erased." His hands trembled slightly. Lucille's tone never shifted. "You don't have to name it after me. You don't have to report to any board. The only condition is that you make it real, and that it outlives the shame of what this place has hidden." Elijah opened his mouth, closed it, then finally spoke. "Why me?" Lucille smiled. "Because you did what none of them ever could. You told the truth, and you made the world listen." The cafe fell silent again. Except this time Elijah wasn't. He was deciding. She asked for a private meeting with Elijah, and made an offer that stunned him. Elijah Reed stood alone in a warehouse once used to store surplus MIT lab equipment, rusted carts, broken prototypes, forgotten chalkboards. Now, it was the headquarters of something new. Reverb. The name wasn't just a title, it was a mission. Because Elijah didn't want to build a school, he wanted to build an echo. One loud enough to carry every name that had ever been erased, every rejection letter ever folded in silence, every folder buried under institutional polish. An echo that would reverberate through walls meant to contain brilliance. And with Lucille Adair's seed funding, and the help of a growing army of volunteers, former students, journalists, and now national allies, Reverb had gone from an idea to a real place in less than 90 days. The school had no gates, no admission fees, no legacy boxes to check. Just one question on the application: what have you built in the shadows? And what could you do in the light? MIT had issued a statement 2 weeks after the live stream. It came through a polished video featuring the president and 2 board members, seated beside carefully selected students of color. They acknowledged concerning procedural oversights. They announced a commission to review all admissions protocols, especially legacy practices. They said the words D37 once, carefully, as if it were an accounting error. They never said Elijah's name. They never apologized to Jordan. They didn't even mention Hart. It was a repair job. But the building was already burning. By then Elijah had already moved on. He had a staff of 8. Jordan became director of mentorship. Zuri ran outreach. And Alden Hart, once a symbol of silent complicity, served as curriculum lead, writing math programs alongside young minds who weren't just students. They were survivors. Every whiteboard was covered in symbols. Not of the past, of what could come next. Reverb didn't have an endowment. It had a movement. Applications opened at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday. Elijah sat in front of the school's single server, watching the dashboard. By 10:03 the server lagged. By 10:05 the site crashed. When they rebooted it, there were over 4,000 applicants. By 10:06 the entire first class was full.
300 seats.
Gone in 6 minutes. And when Elijah pulled the applicant metadata, anonymized, stripped of race, income, or zip code, one field stood out: prior rejection code. Self-reported, D3. 60% of his new students had once been marked as culturally incompatible. Now they were at the center. Not cleaning the halls, redesigning them. At the opening ceremony, Elijah stood before the crowd, with no notes. No mic, just present. These halls were built, not to mirror power, he said, but to amplify what the world has tried to silence. He turned to the first row. Students from Chicago, Lagos, Baltimore, Mumbai, Compton, Appalachia, every one of them holding equations, poems, code, and ideas no gatekeeper could have predicted. This school exists because someone once called us unteachable.